Okay, so we have two phenomenal presenters this evening. Susan, I'm going to let you introduce Mike, since you and I'll do Matt. So Matt is a mad artist, an activist, an educator dedicated to exploring madness as a cultural identity. As the founder, director of the Center for Mad Culture, he brings experience as a practicing visual artist and an advocate to challenge uh, psychiatric har psychiatric narratives and uplift mad voices. His work has been exhibited internationally, and he has been an artist in a residency at the McDowell and the Surf Point. Tell me if I've read any of it wrong. But I also want to say there's a community such a culture of community. I had the opportunity to spend some time in Chicago at the Center for Mad Culture, and it was a blessing. And I'm just overjoyed to have Matt here. And Susan, would you like to do Michael's bio, or would you like me to do it?
So Michael and I worked together a very long time ago when he was the director. He was the chair of the disability studies, and I was working as the administrative assistant to Deba, who was the person who ran the organization. So we go way back. I don't even know what years those were. But Michael's a historian, and he has been involved in lots of different historical projects, including what has now become the Viscardi Museum on Long Island. It was originally in Buffalo, at the University of Buffalo, where he's headquartered, and he got it started along with Lori Block. So he got the work going, and then Buffalo wasn't able to hold on to it for a variety of reasons, and so the Viscardi Center that's on Long Island has taken it over and has just opened this month, which is really exciting. I'm sure, Michael, you're excited to see what you started now really coming to fruition. And Michael's has several books, and he's teaches a lot about madness. I think I probably first heard the word madness in a positive connotation from Michael. I don't think before I knew him, I had heard mad as being a positive thing. I knew the word historically, but not as a positive thing. So I think he's going to help us learn how madness has transitioned through time. And we'll all be a little more knowledgeable about the history of that word and the movement and why we are where we are today.
So, how would we like to do this, gentlemen? I don't know who would like to present first. Sorry, a little disorganized, but that's okay. It's all flowing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, who would like to present first? Would you guys like to go turnabout, or how would you guys like to do it?
I was thinking, Michael, because he could give us an overall perspective of the movement first, and then Matt can go into more
I
current times.
That
Perfect. I gave sharing permission, so you are good to go.
all right. Well, that's fine with me if that's okay with you, Matt. Yeah, and thank you so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many people here. And thank you to Susan for that generous introduction. We do go way back to the earlier days of SDS, not the earliest days, but quite a while ago. So thank you so much for that really kind and generous introduction. It's nice to see some familiar names on the screen as well. And thank you to everyone who organizes the different spaces, the different virtual online spaces. It's really wonderful to be able to have this community, this kind of collective across the US and other places. So for folks to get together and organize and share stories and experiences. And as KK and Susan mentioned, I am a historian. I'm at UB. I do the history of disability and the history of madness, the history of psychiatry and institutions, and more importantly, institutionalized people, what we might call mad people's history, and the history of disability as well. I've been doing it for a number of years. Um, I'll actually share, if that's okay with folks. I'll share my screen so you
Sure.
have something to look at other than my ugly mug. So
Uh-huh.
so I came because I wanted to talk about madness and celebrate madness, and we can talk a bit about why we use the term madness, if you want to. Later, I want to just kind of give a brief intro here to sort of what I've been thinking about in the history of madness for quite a while now, and tell you a little bit about what I'm up to, and hopefully that will open up some ideas and comments and questions and other other things that we can talk about once we've heard from Matt as well. So I wanted to first, of course, acknowledge Judi. Welcome to Judi's room. It's so neat to have this space in honor of Judi Chamberlain, who we all know and really admire and respect. She and so many other folks in the mid-century, mid-20th century, worked to move people out of hospitals and other institutions and challenge psychiatric authority on many levels and worked to tell their own stories and organize this movement that became this kind of broad-based mad people's movement throughout North America, or at least the United States and Canada. As was mentioned, I'm Mike Rembis. I'm a historian at UB, but I also identify as a trauma survivor, a physical trauma, but also with some accompanying emotional trauma, identify as disabled. I've been part of the disability rights movement for about 30 years or more now. Although I've had experiences with mental distress and other mental troubles and all sorts of things over the years, I've never been psychiatrized, so I don't identify as mad, but as an ally to the mad people's movement and to people who identify as mad and to those folks who don't too, who identify in other ways as well. And I thought what I would do is tell you a little bit about this new book that I had been working on for quite a while that just came out last year. Oops, sorry, my thing automatically scrolled. Um, which is
Mhm.
which is called Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum. And I'm gonna switch PowerPoints for a second because I wanted to say a little bit more about this book before we talk more generally about madness and the Mad People's Movement in the later 20th century. So here's my information again, and I can share this with folks if you want to contact me at UB through email. That's usually the best way to contact me. Um, but so about a decade ago, or even longer than a decade ago, I became really interested in thinking about the history of madness in the United States. I'm a U.S. historian. Before the time when we most kind of readily associate the movement and the kind of organizing of people, which we usually think of like the 1960s, the 1970s, and even more recently the 1990s and beyond. And as a historian, I was interested in the earlier period, and I wanted to think about can we write a mad people's history of madness and asylum commitment, involuntary commitment, the experience of being an inmate in an asylum and getting out of the asylum and trying to move back into the community and the friendships and relationships and other relationships that are formed within the institution. Think about all of those things from the perspective of um, people who had been committed to institutions, because there was just not much there. And historians of medicine, historians of psychiatry often completely ignored or discounted the experiences of mad people, of people who had been admitted to asylums, and didn't really consider that evidence much at all. In fact, they were completely dismissive of it. And so I really wanted to make an intervention into the historiography, as it's called, the study of asylums. But I also really wanted to really write that early history of mad people and of commitment to asylums and their experiences, um, for the movement, and for people who identify as part of that movement today, all over the world. I wanted to kind of show that there was an earlier history. And so I went on this search, this kind of quest for all types of sources, from folks who were institutionalized. And I found quite a bit of evidence, and I was able to write this book, as I said, that came out last year, um, telling the story of the rise of asylums in the United States from the 1830s through the 1950s, from the perspective.
Michael, we've got a request to expand your PowerPoint.
Okay, let me see. I can do that. Sure. Like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. So
That's
so
okay.
as I said, I was searching for these sources, and I ended up finding a lot of sources,
Oh,
from people who had been committed, and I was able to write this book. And as I said, I focused specifically on the earlier period, 1830 to 1950, because usually when we think about asylums and asylum survivors, we think of the post-war years after World War II, and even after, as I said, like the 1960s and 70s. So I really kind of wanted to write that earlier history. And so I was able to write this book, that is told from the perspective of people who, at the time in the 19th century phrasing, were considered insane, or had considered themselves insane, in various ways, and had been committed to asylums, and then came out and spoke in public about their experiences, spoke with other asylum survivors, traveled. Some of them traveled around, regionally around, where they lived, and also nationally throughout the United States to tell the story, of what's going on in these asylums and the story of their experiences, and to actually lobby legislatures and, politicians and others to enact reform in this system that was growing and expanding throughout the 19th century and into the early, 20th century. And
20th.
yeah, and so I found some really exciting, stuff, some really good, evidence, and, that I used to write this book. And I won't, kind of, talk about all of the chapters here. There's 9 of them. But I start out in the intro introducing the topic, talking about how we haven't really heard the voices of these people. The intro is entitled Hearing Voices, and that's a play on this notion that hearing voices is a sign of madness. But what I'm saying in the intro is that historians haven't heard the voices of mad people, and that we need to hear them. We need to listen to our mad informants, from the past. And so that's what I've done in this study. And then, the first chapter, I talk about them, claiming a mad identity in the 19th and early 20th century, really speaking out as, asylum survivors, as people who survived involuntary commitment and involuntary drugging within the institution, and who got out and wanted to speak about those experiences. And so we're really, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to change that. And so who were really, speaking as people with lived experience,
Mhm.
in public and working to enact change. And then in the second chapter, I talk about the process of commitment to asylums. And so it's called, and the violence that's in that process often. I talk about it as a process of negotiation among family and other people, in mad people's lives, and sort of placing mad people at the center of that process of negotiation, and argument and conflict sometimes when people are being committed. And so I take on that in the second chapter. And then in the third chapter, I talk about their writing and their work, their reform work, and think about writing and organizing as work, which historians haven't really done. And then chapters 4 and 5, sorry, this thing keeps automatically changing. Chapters 4 and 5 are they really um, show the work that these folks did. Folks like this man here, who identified as Moses Swan in his written work. This is an illustration from his pamphlet that he produced. This is him in restraints. He's showing the types of restraints that they used on people who were considered mad or insane in the asylum in the 19th century. But so he and others, I look at the ways in which they were exposing the abuses that they endured and that they witnessed in the institution, that ranged from physical abuse to sexual assault and emotional abuse and neglect and all sorts of other abuses that they faced in the asylum. And then in chapter 5, the reform work that many of them did, going to the state legislature, lobbying politicians for legal changes. Some of them went to DC and lobbied the president, which it wasn't uncommon in the 19th century for folks to just go to the White House and hang out there and wait to visit with the president and speak with the president. And many of them did that, and a few lobbied the United States Congress for legal change at the federal level. And so I look at that in chapter 5. And then chapter 6, toward the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, physicians became more important. They had been important in the 19th century as well, but sort of what we might call scientific medicine and all the diagnostic labels that we think of today, many of them came into use around the turn of the 20th century. And so people that were living at that time and who were committed at that time really had to grapple with this rise of what we call scientific medicine. And some of them gained allies among physicians. Physicians sort of sided with them and worked with them to enact change and enact reform. But then on other levels, they were sort of speaking back against the physicians and kind of resisting the various ways in which physicians were attempting to control the diagnostic process and control their treatment. And so I talk about that in chapter 6, and then 7 talk in more detail about the treatments they endured within the asylum, all the various interventions onto their bodies, different kind of ways in which physicians were attempting to cure their madness in the asylum, and what that looked like from their perspective, from the people who had to actually endure these treatments. And then chapter 8, I look at the relationships that were formed in the institution, because I think for too long, too many historians really didn't pay attention to mad people at all in their studies, or when they did, sort of saw them as the objects of medical intervention or the objects of diagnosis, or as sort of the victims of incarceration. And here I'm trying to I present a more nuanced description of their experiences. Many of them formed really meaningful. They didn't get along all the time, but many of them formed meaningful relationships in the institution based on their shared experiences. And some of those relationships endured after they left the asylum. And so that's what I kind of look at in chapter 9. And that's really where we start to see what we might call peer support, and other efforts outside the institution to support one another emerge in the early 20th century. In the years like the 1920s through the 1940s, folks were. Then I look I look nationally throughout the book, but in chapter 9, there's a group in Chicago that I look at who, members of the group, they formed the group on their own. They were all survivors of asylum commitment, and they formed the group on their own, and they something. They went back into the asylum and went onto the wards to support people who were still there, and they helped each other to to kind of reintegrate themselves into the community after they were out. They provided peer support to one another in the community, in their homes and other spaces. And so it's really neat to see that developing, in the early 20th century, long before we see it in the later 20th century. And then in the epilogue, I talk about the importance of telling stories and the need to tell our stories as disabled and mad people, and the fact that we or the power that we have when we tell our stories and we share our stories, especially in public. And so that's the basic outline of the book. And I wanted to just one example. Calissa Lathrop, she was committed in the later 19th century, 1880 to 1882. She's a really remarkable woman that most historians just don't know about and don't write about. She was very active. She freed herself from the Utica Asylum, which was the state asylum in New York, with the help of a former inmate who was a lawyer and helped other people to get out as well. She published her own account of her experiences. She appeared before the New York State Legislature twice. She formed her own reform organization, which was she called the well, it was she and her friends and colleagues, but the Anti-Kidnapping League and Lunacy Reform Union. And so she was really, really active, and she's just one of the few people, or one of the many rather, people that I look at in this book. Oops, God, I don't know why it keeps speeding through these. But some of the larger things that I think this history reveals, and this is actually a picture of the Utica Asylum from the 1850s in the background here. And you can see people visiting. But some of the bigger, conclusions I think we can make is that these asylums were contested spaces from the very beginning. People who were labeled mad or insane, contested them. Weren't sort of passive, victims of institutionalization, and weren't the kind of passive objects of the doctor's interventions. And so they were very contested. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, it shows that there were, that folks had agency and were really active from the very beginning in shaping this system and trying in some cases to abolish it. I mean, they saw how abusive it could be, and some of them attempted to abolish it. And that leads into the second point, which is that activism and advocacy existed well before the mid 20th century, which is when we most often associate it with. We often just think about maybe the 1970s to the present, but this kind of activism existed as early as the 1830s and probably even earlier than that. But we at least have a lot of records beginning in the 1830s of people, as I've been saying, speaking out and organizing. And so mad people and their allies shaped medical and legal, and popular culture. And then finally, I think it reveals the humanity of asylum inmates, which for so long had been dehumanized in various ways. Yeah. And so I don't know how to I don't know how to minimize this now that I made it big, but I want to stop sharing for a second, and I'll just stop sharing and see if I can figure out how to make this go away, which I don't know how. Oh, good. Okay, there. It
Got
ended.
it?
I
Okay.
got it to go away, yes. So that was a little bit of an overview of my book. And if you could just indulge me maybe for a couple more minutes, I'm going to pull up a different PowerPoint because I want to talk about more recent developments as well. And so let me just show this one. And so I mentioned a little bit about my book, but I wanted to think about why we think about madness. And I think, it's because of the rise of the Mad Pride movement, which emerged, in the I think psych survivors and users and consumers and people who more recently identify as psychosocially disabled have been organizing for decades. And by the 1990s, at least in Toronto and other places, there was this Mad Pride movement that was emerging, which really redefined the term mad and really made it a symbol of pride and representative of the experiences of people who had been committed or had other experiences with psychiatric intervention. And so I think that, um, some disabled people use the term crip in the same way. They say that they're crips.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think that is one of the reasons why we should use the term mad. And of course, we don't all have to identify as mad. We don't have to use that term. We can identify as users or consumers or survivors or in other ways. But I think it's important, to really recognize the kind of positive connotations of the word mad. And then as a historian, I use the term madness because that's how the field identifies itself. And that's because, madness is this big kind of broad term where, it's not wedded to certain diagnostic labels. It's got a lot of space. In my mind, I think, for criticism of the development of, or critiques at least, of the development of psychiatry and psychiatric interventions. And so we use the term history of madness in the field, as academics. And I and others, Jeff Rayom in Toronto and others, have been developing this field of mad people's history over the last several decades, which the book that I just mentioned is part of. This idea of telling this history from the perspective of folks who have lived experiences, folks who lived through these various interventions throughout the decades. And so that's why we use the term mad. And of course, I'm happy to talk about that as well. Before I leave you, and I wanted to say that this Mad People's movement is growing as well, as I'm sure all of you know, around the world. It's become a global movement. People in Latin America and South America, on the African continent, in Europe, and elsewhere are increasingly identifying with this Mad People's movement. And that's actually going to be my next book project. This one that I just mentioned, just talked to you about, goes to 1950, roughly 1951 to be more precise. So this new book that I'm working on is going to go from the 1940s or 1950 to the present. And so I'm really interested in tracing this history of the development of this kind of global transnational Mad People's movement over those decades in the 20th century. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, if folks want to tell their stories, and I'm sure there are a lot of opportunities and spaces to tell our stories, but we have one more here at UB. We're working to create a really robust archive, an online archive, a digital archive of oral histories and other interviews, of writing workshops and of arts-based storytelling. We're calling this the co-creation of stories of madness and disability. And the goal is to create this archive and library and resource center that will be made available to anyone who wants to use it, anyone who has access to the internet. And the goal is to really have our voices be preserved, have our stories be preserved, for history, for folks who are interested years or decades from now, and to foster community around the world, among us and between us. And also as a teaching and research, a teaching resource and a place to do research as well. So if you're interested at all in that, and in telling your story and preserving your story, you can reach out to me about that as well. So that's everything I wanted to share with you. And of course, I can say a lot more, but I want Matt to speak. And so if you have any questions, I would be glad to to think about them later in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really do appreciate it. And I got to share that as you were speaking and sharing the time frames, I wish I could say that it seems quite different. Somebody that was institutionalized as a juvenile, the entire I actually think that the presentation was stating there was even more of a voice of shaping than there was. There was a real lull for about 50 years of a real oppression, but the tactics were still the same. And so, kind of reflecting on that, and I'm glad that you're going to be writing about that gap in time because I
Yeah.
think that's kind of where there has been a big shift. And so I really appreciate it. I really value it. I hope that everybody can hold questions until after Matt shares. And I think that we're going to have a really robust dialogue and conversation. So if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat for everybody else. And then if not, we will wait till the end. So thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
And Matt, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do this. And thank you, Michael, for. I'm very pleased that you went first. I was hoping that would happen because I do think that that really does set some historical stage. I'm also going to be talking. I mean, the whole point, I guess, was some like mad history. So I'm going to be talking about historical mad culture, more from what I perceive as like the cultural side of madness. And this is a question that I've had since I grew up as a visual artist and poet, and kind of thinking that was my world, and then my own madness sort of changed the trajectory of my life. And I began to recently look at what I see as the cultural production of mad people and why that has specifically been dismissed or overly romanticized and sort of made into the genius sort of tropes that we use. So I think that there was a lot in what Michael was saying, right, about like both systems of control. We're going to see systems of control also activated in regard to cultural control. But then also when we talk about what Michael was saying about the humanity of the inmates, I think that the cultural production is also going to show that mad people have long been active cultural producers. And when we delimit them, when we tell them that they are not capable of cultural production, we actually enhance the stigma. We prove a point by saying that they cannot and do not have a place in our society, as opposed to our society doesn't make a place for them. So I do have some images I wanted to share. Let me see if that is going. And slight apology, it's not a PowerPoint, so you'll see. I have the play button on here. I make this is a much larger presentation, which I'll give some snippets of, and then of course we can ask and answer questions a little bit later. But for the sake of brevity, I'll only go back to sort of like the mid 19th century, when we get this real spurt. Psychiatry is really coming to terms with itself as a practice. But then we get artists who are also moving and shifting away from realism because the camera's been invented. There are other things happening at that time, and so there's major shifts occurring in art making. And we start to get representations of mad people. Rarely is it by the mad people themselves, though occasionally it does occur. We have Francesco de Goya on the left-hand side here with this scene from a madhouse. If you know Goya or art history, he, in the later part of his life, was certainly a mad person, though not necessarily interned. And then on the right-hand side, we have this courtyard of an asylum painted by Vincent van Gogh. Most of us probably are familiar with him and his work, but this idea that he comes from that lineage of the genius trope and that mad people must serve a specific function. If they're going to be artists, they should be the genius artists. And if they're not the genius artists, we sort of dismiss their qualifications as cultural creators. And this really comes about in that late 19th century. One of the examples I'm going to give is actually from Chicago. This is the Cook County Insane Asylum, also known as Dunning, which has a really dark history of its own. But one of the interesting things is that these asylums often used art making in their sort of quote unquote therapeutic practices, even though they weren't necessarily art therapy practitioners at the time. They did understand and see some value to it, probably because it kept inmates quiet. At some level, it gave them productive quality as well as it made them happy. But in Dunning, there's this newspaper article that talks about an art exhibition at the asylum. And this art exhibition, as they highlight specific artisans and the inmates, they were making wagons out of found barrel parts. They were making violins out of cigar boxes. They were doing paintings with like dirt and like raw materials. And the person who writes the article has a really funny sort of viewpoint, which is maybe perhaps too similar to most of the world's viewpoint at the time, in that as you see these things, you marvel at how one could possibly create this kind of work. But then on the next breath, he says, but also in this, they almost look human. They almost appear like they have a soul. And so there's this dichotomy between see this amazing work, but also, man, you would almost mistake them for one of us. And so even in this artistic production, they're not really seeing it as real culture. They're not really understanding it as a productive quality of culture making. And it comes back to several artists. We have Vincent van Gogh, who we're all familiar with, Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso, maybe you're familiar with. All of these are the artists who are kind of working in that same time period, and not all of them. I won't get into too much art history, unless we got some art history nerds in the crowd. We can chat a little later, but they're at the same time. We move from that Van Gogh, Cézanne, Picasso, who are like the early modernists, the impressionists and post-impressionists. And as we move into the 20th century, we bridge this movement in towards what becomes surrealism, Dadaism, higher modernism, things like that. And we get a range of artists leading into that. And many of them come out of France. So we have Alfred Jarry, Stéphane Mallarmé, and Guillaume Apollinaire. And these guys all kind of lead the way. They start to break tradition in language. And at that same time in psychiatry or alienism, the pre-psychiatry, language was used often to predict mental health, to assume madness in people. They wrote a lot of books around how language can and does allow people to diagnose somebody based on their handwriting or the way they use language. So these Jarry, Mallarmé, and Apollinaire were poets who were breaking language apart and really playing with what it looks like spatially on a page. But then we get a group of sort of psychiatry and psychiatry adjacent folks who are doing work with mad people. So we have Cesar Lombroso on the left-hand side, who wrote Man of Genius, which is this idea that the mad people can be genius. There's a link there in genius. And so it's really critical. He's actually not even a psychiatrist, he's a criminologist. So he's got this link to what it means to be a genius and what it means to be mad. And it's kind of more, I'm reducting it a little bit, but it's like this move toward either you're a criminal or a genius. Max Nordau wrote Degenerates, which became hugely influential to the Nazi Party, and this assumption that mad people could be and are to be considered degenerate in many ways. The argument of his work was also placed against Vincent van Gogh. After his death, we now see Van Gogh as this like hyper famous, very well known and influential artist. But even after his death and through the early part of the 20th century, Max Nordau's philosophy had taken over, and people saw Van Gogh as a degenerate because he had a mental illness. So his work wasn't even highly regarded for some of that. So kind of an interesting relationship there. But then on the far right, we have Auguste Marie, who is a psychiatrist in the early 20th century. We'll talk a little bit more about him, just so I don't spend too long digging in on hopefully not boring history. But one of the more important surrealists, and in fact the founder, quote unquote, of surrealism, is Andre Breton. And this is where I really want to start getting in on this, because this is the point at which art making, and then Breton was more of a poet, perchance, but the people that ran in that circle were a mix between writers and visual artists, sculptors, things like that. But Breton specifically worked with Auguste Marie, the psychiatrist. He collected artwork. So in the early part of Marie's practice in the asylum, this is a view of one of the rooms in there, and he would collect artwork by all the inmates as they were making things. So you see this array of things, and he was a little bit more like a anthropologist sort of study. So he was finding things, and people would collect them and put them into boxes, and that was very common as he would allow them to do. And there were two works in particular that Andre Breton bought. And these are the two pieces here. We do not know the artist's name, though it would have been available had he cared. The point is that he didn't care, and so they remain anonymous to this day. But these two boxes became very influential to early Andre Breton, who started to see these as mementos for how one could change the state of their mind into madness, and one could emulate madness in order to produce new culture. And surrealism was meant to sort of supersede culture and come up on top of it. And so he collected these two boxes. They were shown in New York. I want to say it was around the 1930s. And it kind of blew the world apart. There was a show there. It was Surrealists, Dadaists, and there were only a handful of things actually made by mad people, though the works by mad people were all anonymized. Nobody ever knew their names. So all the artists had names, but the actual inmates making work were always unknown. But in the 1930s in New York, at the exact same time that the show was up, for any art history people in the room, there was a woman sculptor. Oops, I went a little too far. Louise Nevelson. And Louise Nevelson eventually became famous after. She did see this show. Now, this is conjecture on my part that she's copying it in some way, but I do believe she was inspired by it. Louise Nevelson started making these large kind of boxes of her own that were assembled things, and then just monochromatically painting them. And she became very, very famous for this in her lifetime. But as we get a little further along into the 20th century, one of the most famous books that comes out around art and madness is published by Hans Prinzhorn, which is Artistry of the Mentally Ill in 1922. And it influences all of these artists tremendously. So Max Ernst being one of the other ones. Certainly Andre Breton had picked up a copy, but Max Ernst specifically met Hans Prinzhorn because Ernst was going around to asylums and buying artwork from inmates. And this was actually a cultural practice at the time, is that these asylums are making artwork, and they were actually selling. So it is true that the artists in the asylums should have been making money from their sale of their work. There was enough interest that there were rooms built. There's a famous artist named Adolf Wolfli, an outsider artist, quote unquote outsider artist, and the asylum he was at in Waldo built a specific room as a gallery for his work because it was so popular. So it is important for us to understand as mad culture sort of understanding that people appreciated what mad culture was. They were just never given context or kind of a relevant historical perspective of it. It was always glamorized and kind of romanticized. It was always about the kind of the suffering of the artist. But Hans Prinzhorn writes this book, Artistry of the Mentally Ill, and in it he lists 10 quote-unquote schizophrenic masters. And these are the 10. This is the 10 here on the listed: August Netter, Karl Brendel, August Klotz, Peter Meyer, Johann Neuffer, Victor Orth, Hermann Biel, Heinrich Weiss, Joseph Sell, Franz Karl Bueller. And this one on top is a August Netter drawing. And I'm bringing this one up specifically because it is a way in which we see Max Ernst on the left specifically took the composition and style of mad artistry and copied it for his own purposes. And so here is a drawing by Max Ernst. Another example of influenced by mad culture. On the right hand side is Max Ernst. He does these kinds of drawings. He's constructed kind of machine like drawings. But on the left hand side is an unknown artist in an asylum. And the artist is from the exact same time period that Ernst would have been traveling there. So I, again, conjecture on my part that he's even seen this. I just find it too similar in a way to say that there could not have been some sort of influence here, because there's so many works by mad artisans who remain anonymous, while Max Ernst, Andre Breton, all of these artists are memorialized in our institutions of culture, and yet mad people remain silent. Another example is in Paul Eluard and Robert Desnos, again, surrealist artists. They write a book, and the book, they write an article within a magazine, a surrealist magazine. The magazine article is called Genius Without a Mirror, and in it they publish, quote unquote, they publish these poems and writings by inmates of the asylum. But come to find out, it was just Paul Eluard and Robert Desnos that wrote the entire thing. So they are mimicking madness in order to gain sort of a notoriety, and to also kind of position themselves as the avant-garde. The most interesting element of kind of modern thinking is to free yourself of the mind. Yet the people that they're copying are still locked in asylums. They're still suffering. They're still going through the tragedies that they do in the system, while artists are kind of like running amok with the same stylistic choices. Andre Breton does the same thing with Paul Eluard, again, in Immaculate Conception. They published this book, and in the back of it is a whole series of writings that are, they say, are the attempted simulation of mental debility, acute mania, general paralysis, interpretive delirium, and dementia praecox. For those of you who may know, dementia praecox is the early term for what we now call schizophrenia. So they took on the persona of all of these diagnoses, and they wrote from those standpoints. And there's many, many, many more examples of this sort of theft of the stylistic choices of mad people in asylums in order to prop up modernist and surrealist thinkers. And again, all of them have become very famous for it, while the inmates themselves remain a bit obscured from history. Until we start to get people like Jean Dubuffet in the 1950s and 60s, so post-World War II, he comes in. And Dubuffet is famous for starting the movement called Art Brut. Art Brut is not as horrible as it might sound. It sounds like we're calling mad people, or the others that were collected in this case, that we're calling them brutes. But it's a translation problem. So he's just saying art made sort of like raw. So it maybe more translates towards like raw art. So Art Brut is the movement he founds, and really he defines it, and he becomes a very strict gatekeeper to what is Art Brut. And in that, he says that Art Brut is made by people untouched by civilization. And he has very, very, very strict guidelines around this. For example, one person had been included in his Art Brut collection. He would go around to asylums and buy all this artwork. And one of the artists that he had purchased, he did not know at the time, had a cousin who played violin for an orchestra. And as soon as Dubuffet found this out, he cut that guy from the collection because he had a familial connection to culture. So he was assuming that mad people are devoid of culture, that mad people, to be collected and important in his viewpoint, had to somehow be so raw human that they could not be touched or influenced by anything else. And so therefore the genius really comes forward. Of course, this is absurdity, because who is in some way not touched by the culture that surrounds them, even if it, and the problem, again, that I find is that he assumes that asylum culture is not a culture of its own and somehow not influential. So there's a lot of standpoints that kind of come up against this, but it becomes further problematized when in the 1970s, Roger Cardinal then introduces Art Brut. He translates it to what we now use as outsider art. So the term outsider art is an American translation of Art Brut. And again, it has a very strict sort of structure around it, though much more loose than what Dubuffet was talking about. In a lot of my readings, Cardinal does this interesting thing where he says that one of the problems he has is people keep as he came up with outsider art. Of course, mad people and disabled folks have had huge problems with this term outsider art. There's been a lot of conflict around this term, and they've offered a lot of alternative terms. And he wrote an essay in which he said that he's kind of tired of seeing all these alternatives, and really it's just a problem of labeling, and we should just get over it and use his label. Without him realizing that what he has done is exactly what he's complaining about other people doing, is he's putting labels onto things. And so he's got this really, really defensive attitude around the term outsider art. And of course he does. It's his brand, and he ran with it, and he built an entire career off of it. And so he's like really, really defending it, while mad and disabled activists are trying to come to this field and say, no, we're not outside anything. We're not outsiders in any regard. Can we change this? And he explicitly denies any opportunity to do that. I'm going to skip ahead here for a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the names that were actually removed from history. Andre Breton, again, if you are unfamiliar, wrote one of his most famous books is called Nadia. Nadia is this sort of walk through Paris with this woman, Nadia, who is a schizophrenic, and it was mind-blowing to people at the time. It was very well regarded. But throughout the course of this book, there are only 2 women in the book, and then the rest of them are famous men. And all the men are named, but the 2 women in the book are not named. Nadja is not her real name, and X is the other woman. Neither of them are given real names in the book. So here, Nadja is Leona Delcourt, and X is Suzanne Musard. So I think it's really important to understand what naming does, what giving and putting forward actual names to people can offer. I think it goes a little bit to what Michael was talking about earlier, all the people that come through these asylums tend to remain anonymous. Their graves are anonymous. In Chicago, we have this former site of Dunning Asylum that I showed earlier. There's a park in which 32,000 bodies are buried, and a majority of them are nameless. Somebody has gone through and started to find records and who might be buried there. So there's an assumption that we maybe know about 13,000 names, but again, they were all forgotten about. So not naming allows us to forget. And the other thing about Leona Delacourt is as we talk about this sort of schizophrenic model and its exploitation by people like Breton, Delacourt, as a woman who herself was actually mad in many regards, after the writing of the book, it became very popular, and she sought help from the surrealists. She was going through her own crises. She was needing food. She was needing shelter. She just needed assistance. And there's ample proof that as soon as the book was published, they discarded her and left her to her own devices. And she just disappeared and presumably passed shortly after that. So this exploitation in many ways has real life consequences. Same thing happens in Jacques Lacan's book. He uses the writings of Amy, and it never actually names her. Her real name is Marguerite Pantane. She did not realize the full sort of scope in which Lacan was using her works. She wanted to have her works published. She just didn't necessarily understand it was being published as psychiatry. And so she requested her writings back because she wanted them published. Lacan never returned her writings to her. And so the full scope of her writing has disappeared. We only have excerpts that Lacan uses in his quotes in his books. So the full books have disappeared from history because he refused to return them to Marguerite. Now, the 10 artists before that I mentioned, the 10 schizophrenic artists, again, those are not their real names in the book. I can give you those real names. I'm just going to skip through them now for the sake of going through this, but you can see each of them here with a sample of their artwork. And these are all, the 10 schizophrenic masters are all men, though men were not the only people collected in the Prinzhorn collection or the Dubuffet collection. So this is Alice Blankenhorn, Alexandra Galano, Sonia Gessner, Emma Hawk, Alfred Loswackler, Agnes Richter. I'll cut that stuff out there at the end just so we can get to some questions, have better discussion. But all this is to say that entire sort of exponential growth of modernist art came at the cost of mad people and the idea of what culture could have represented to mad people. So what I'm trying to do here in Chicago at the Center for Mad Culture is to reinvigorate that discussion around mad cultural production and what does that look like and how can mad people participate in that discussion as opposed to being talked about all the time. So I'm just gonna end it there and then give everybody a chance perhaps for questions and a more robust discussion. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Matt. I really want to thank you. And I'm not gonna lie, it made me reflect of what they now refer to as recovery crafts
Yep.
in the coloring books of now that they put into recovery settings, institutional hospital settings. It almost makes me laugh, but it also made me reflect on there is this element of that isolation. And I went back to look and see some of the art that I did during that time that I continue to. It's a style that I think there's a different heart and passion behind it. And, I really think that the dialogue of the creativity within the darkest of places can be the most profound. And so I just celebrate you guys are dialoguing about this and talking about what it is for now, right? Kind of um, invigorating the dialogue, the conversation, and the culture that we need to bring to the forefront because I think that it's not a culture in the world's eyes right now. It's a consumer, it's a control, it's coercion. And so I just really celebrate this dialogue. And I think that there should be so much more of it. So, also with the rise of, I do want to encourage everybody that, we've gotten so many more requests over the last couple of years of the celebration of Mad Pride parades. How do they get started? How do you start one in your local area? So I do want to say that that is something that brings a lot of joy to my heart because I really do think that, the more we can be loud and proud, even if we do disability pride and mad pride together. I know that's in my backyard we're going to be doing this year. And I'm really excited about that. And so I just want to open it up for questions because this was such an awesome presentation. I actually learned a lot. I didn't know that I expected to, but I did. I learned a lot, so I'm really, really grateful. Um, if anybody has questions, please raise your hand and we will get right to you. Um, I think that we will have quite a few questions. I know there was a couple coming in the chat, but I want to see if anybody's ready just to raise their hand and ask a question. Yes, Elizabeth, you go first.
Hi there. Um,
Hello.
I identify as mad and disabled, and I'm also just so interested in all this stuff. I love this presentation. And my questions are for Michael. First of all, I wanted to ask you, I know that the institutions were racially segregated. So I'm interested in what about race? Did you find voices and activism by mad people of color pre-1950?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. That's a really great question, a really important question too. Yeah, many of the institutions were segregated by race, or they had separate institutions in the South for Black inmates. And unfortunately, although I do talk about this in the book, the psychiatric system is kind of structured by and through race. I mean, diagnostic categories and experiences are, racialized in many ways. But the folks who spoke out and who were organizing, and who were most vocal in writing were predominantly white. And I acknowledge that in the book, and I kind of, foreground that their whiteness. Fortunately, I think for researchers and for all of us, they were pretty equally distributed among women and men. They were equally active in writing. They were pretty well distributed throughout the country. And they were actually fairly diverse in terms of their social position and economic background. And many wrote about in the 19th century wrote about the fact that being committed was often a huge strain, and many of them ended up poor as a result of being committed, and so they weren't always, sort of upper class or middle class. That changes a bit in the early 20th century. Some of them are better off financially. But yeah, so it's difficult to get at the sort of firsthand accounts, voices of people of color. The mad writers, I call them mad writers. It's the term that I kind of used for the book. Mad writers mention being side by side, especially, folks who were in northern or western, far western, West Coast asylums, mention being side by side with people of color, either Chinese folks or African Americans. And so they kind of share their shared experiences with them. And I talk about that in the book. For example, there's this really wonderful story of a woman she's at a county asylum, which she doesn't name, but she says that she and her friends on the ward, they meet secretively in the bathroom and they have this kind of group that they form. And they teach each other about how to survive in the institution, what to do, what not to do, how to behave in front of the staff and other folks. And the leader of that group was an African American woman, and they talk about her, as someone who had experience and who was knowledgeable and helped them. And so those kind of moments are in the book, but I just couldn't find any firsthand accounts, for this time period. But there are other studies of institutions that have emerged in the past few years. Um, that look at institutions that were predominantly Black in the South, and those are really helpful to think about this. The asylum inmate population, the population of color was really small before Reconstruction. It's after, it's kind of during and after Reconstruction that, there are many more people of color that begin to appear in these institutions. But yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it so we could talk about it.
I just want to follow up by saying I'm really excited about this. I mean, Elizabeth Packard is well known. There's several biographies of her
Yeah.
as an activist, but I'm not mad, I'm not mad. And the latest
Yeah.
Elizabeth Packard bio is really the author really centers around
Yeah.
the outrage of, how could you lock this woman up when she's not mad? So
Yeah.
really great to center our own voices.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. I'm sorry, I won't go on and on, I promise. But that was one of the things that I was really writing against in this book was, people, we hear about Packard, we hear about Clifford Beers, but they're often spoken about in isolation as exceptions to the inmate population or the, psych survivor community. And they really weren't. There were hundreds, if not thousands. I mean, there were hundreds of surviving, documents that I found from folks, and so there were probably many, many more than that, and they were forming these communities in the 19th and early 20th century. Um, and so that's something I wanted to show, but I also wanted to write against this notion that historians have argued that, well, the people who they were, quote, wrongly committed, they weren't mad. And that's why the very first chapter of my book is called Claiming Madness, because they were overwhelmingly, they identified as, they wouldn't use the term mad, but they identified as insane and said that they had been insane for a long time, that they had, they experienced mental trouble and distress. And even Packard, in her own subtle ways, I would argue, identifies as mad, but I'm in the minority on that position, so I won't push it.
Thank you. That was a Fantastic question. I really do appreciate it. But I also want to highlight there's two things that I want to circle back around to after we get the questions is the unmarked graves at the institutions that I know that because I do know as I was a part of an institution shut down project in Alabama in the early thousands. The unmarked graves were one of those that they didn't want to identify if it was individuals that, as they said, consumers, if it was, there were slaves that were actually, what they referred to as slaves, uh, buried at the very same and the unmarked graves. And there's a lot of projects to kind of mark those and give the honor to the individuals and the families. And I think that's something that is an um, incredibly important work. So I do want to highlight that. But the other thing is I had a flash reminder of just in 2012, uh, a doctor actually taking somebody that was in the institution with me, her artwork home to hang it on the wall. Said
Yeah.
this is fantastic, and they did not share where it went. And I'm just going to tell you, it was a flash of thinking of the co-optation and the robbery of the community. And so, yeah, this is such an important dialogue because I think we became accustomed to it, right? That it was just, rite of passage that we would be exploited even further. So, sorry, I want to let's see, um, go ahead. Who had their hand up first? Anybody?
I'm just going to share this really quickly because somebody asked in the chat, asked the name of the book. It's called Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum. It's from Oxford University Press. And you can get it anywhere, or you can email me, and I can I can send out discounted copies, or if you want to get it. It's Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum.
And I will put your contact information in the chat in just a moment, but so that everybody can grab it if they didn't get a screenshot. Charles, would you like to go next? I think you were next. If I'm wrong, I apologize.
I thought Chopper was before me, but I don't care. Yeah, I actually have COVID and I can't breathe through my nose, so I don't have my picture on. Um, I'm really interested in what they call outsider art. I didn't even realize that was a negative term. And I'm wondering if either one of the speakers know. I mean, there is Altered States of the Arts, which has a new name. I forget what the new name is. But I'm wondering if either of the speakers know any books that may be not too expensive, preferably, and in color, and have decent outsider art, or any websites that have it, if you could maybe put them in the chat.
I'll look for some. Unfortunately, with art books, the good ones in color are going to be way expensive, just because the monograms are not popular, and so there's like a low production, so it increases the cost considerably. So I don't know many that are great that have that are reasonably priced. If you happen to be near Chicago, the Center for Mad Culture does have a library where we've been trying to collect these and have them available for folks because they're not easy to buy. So we have a small section if you're near the Chicago area and want to visit us. I will look for some websites in the meantime. There's a couple of places that will be, I know the Prinzhorn collection is one. You'd be able to Google the Prinzhorn collection. You could also look up the Outsider Art Museum in Lausanne, Switzerland. They have a huge website full of works. Those are the two. Those are the two main ones that I know of.
I forgot to mention the American Museum of Visionary Art in Baltimore, which is really good.
Yeah, and we've got the Intuit Center for Outsider Art. I think they're changing their name to just Intuit here in Chicago as well. They have a website. So there's gonna be a handful of those places. So I'll see if I can find some websites to put in the
What
chat.
was the one in Switzerland?
That's the Outsider Art Museum in Lausanne, Switzerland.
I just wanted to mention quickly too that I recently co-edited and contributed an article to a special issue of it's an academic journal called Disability Studies Quarterly, but it's open access, it's free online, and there's an article in there by a Portuguese scholar, and it's really the whole issue I think is really accessibly written. It's not, it's not too academic. But I'm mentioning this because she wrote a really wonderful article about outsider art and asylums and institutionalized artists and the um, you know, archiving that work and all the issues that arise around that, and the reason why we need to really be active in preserving that work and creating archives so people can see that work and share that work. And she's Portuguese and she's writing about Portugal, but there's similar movements going on in Brazil and elsewhere, around the world. And I can put that link to the DSQ issue in the chat.
Thank